Hi, this is Kristen LaHerde, Assistant Director for Literacy and Continuing Education in the American Library Association's Office for Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services. Thank you for joining this webinar on cultural competence. A little background on our work. The ALA Office for Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services mission is to support library and information science workers in creating all-inclusive spaces that serve and represent the entire community. To accomplish this, we decenter power and privilege by facilitating conversations around access and identity as they impact the profession and those we serve. We use the social justice framework and strive to create an association culture where these concerns are incorporated into everybody's everyday work. Today's webinar will provide context for cultural competence by exploring the concepts of culture, cultural awareness, cultural humility, and intersectionality. We will also introduce some ideas for speakers and presenters to consider in creating a more inclusive experience. As we are speaking with ACRL today, we would be remiss not to mention the already developed ACRL diversity standards, cultural competency for academic libraries. These standards were developed in 2012 by the Racial and Ethnic Diversity Committee of ACRL. The standards provide a framework to support libraries in engaging the complexities of providing services to diverse populations and recruiting and maintaining a diverse library workforce. The standards are meant as a starting point for libraries to develop local approaches in the context of their organization's mission. The ACRL standards provide this definition for cultural competence, which is adapted from the National Association of Social Workers. A congruent set of behaviors, attitudes, and policies that enable a person to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. The process by which individuals and systems respond respectfully and effectively to people of all cultures, languages, classes, races, ethnic backgrounds, religions, and other diversity factors in a manner that recognizes, affirms, and values the worth of individuals, families, and communities, and protects and preserves the dignity of each. The primary pieces of this definition that we use are the sets of behaviors, attitudes, and policies that enable people to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. These behaviors, attitudes, and policies function at the individual level and system level. In today's webinar, we're exploring cultural competence through culture, cultural awareness, cultural humility, and intersectionality. Together, these make up the framework we use. We'll start by exploring and defining culture. To help us do that, we have a clip from a TEDx talk by Pellegrino Riccardi. Riccardi is a cross-cultural expert, public speaker, teacher, and communications consultant.
It's really great to be in Bergen. This is the second time this week I'm in Bergen. I live in Oslo. I guess I'm living in the wrong place. Yeah. As you quite rightly say, my name, Pellegrino, which is my first name, means pilgrim. It was given to me by my Italian parents. It's as if they knew what I was going to do for the rest of my life. You know, let's give him the name Pilgrim and then he'll travel the world. And that's basically what I do. This is my workplace. I do a lot of traveling. I could give you a fancy title of what I do, but what I really do is I try to help people communicate better, especially in a global business world. So I try to help people communicate better with other nationalities. Now, you know, the first thing you think of when you work with other nationalities in cross-cultural communication is, let's look at the other cultures. Well, I take a slightly different approach. I say to people, take a look at yourself. So I'm going to talk a lot about perception, because it's all about perception, understanding what people see. Now, as you say, I have Italian in me. I have a lot of British in me. Some people are often surprised by my English accent. It's quite nice, isn't it? Yeah? Because you weren't expecting this. I know you weren't. You know, you're expecting me to speak with the Italian accent. Yeah? Don't speak like that. And I've been in Norway for over a third of my life, actually. So I've got a lot of Norwegian in me as well. And I love what I like doing with people. I have these little social experiments. to test their perception of me. Now, as I say, I travel a lot, so I like playing with the airlines. I like going up to the airlines and talking English, or sometimes I talk with an Italian accent, to see what kind of reactions I get. And English is the best one. If you want good service, you speak English like I do. It's fantastic. People take you seriously. Well, they do, you know. I mean, yesterday the plane to Bergen was late, you know, and if I go up and say, excuse me, it's 30 minutes late, I'm a punctual person, I don't like being late, you know, they just take you seriously. But yesterday I thought I'd try it in an Italian accent. So I went up and I actually said, you know, excuse me, but the plane is 30 minutes late, I'm a punctual person, you know. Exactly. I got the same reaction as you did there, yeah? And this is one of the problems of working with other nationalities. You know, people see what they want to see, and they don't always see what you see. And this is one of the challenges. Now, just before we get into it, culture, let's look at culture. Culture, my definition of culture, and I know this doesn't cover everything, but let's keep it simple. I usually do 2-day workshops in this. I've got 18 minutes. A system of behavior that helps us act in an accepted or familiar way. Keywords there, accepted or familiar. We're basically doing things which are accepted in our social group and which are familiar. So a lot of my work is actually explaining Norwegian behavior to other nationalities. So I'm constantly looking for this sort of, can we describe a Norwegian in a nutshell? And I think I found it. I found this fantastic text on the internet. I want you to read it with me. It's worth reading, eh? If you were to use a colour to describe this person, he would have to be green. He lives in isolation in his home, a place he best describes as his and cosy. However, he's not the most receptive of people when it comes to visitors. Okay? The typical Norwegian. He is somewhat primitive, but he is honest, straightforward, and all he really wants in life are the simple little pleasures like peace and quiet. Do you recognize any of this? There are some key words that kind of, can you see that? They jump out at you. And you think, okay, it's a stereotype, but a lot of this is a bit true. And I show this to Norwegians, and they kind of nod, yeah, okay, I'll give you that one. And then I surprise them. This is a description not of a Norwegian, but of a Hollywood film star. Yeah, would you like to know who it is? There it is. It's that person there. And the point about this is you often believe what people tell you as well, you know? I could sit there and tell you this is a Norwegian, yeah, and you believe it. It's not a Norwegian at all, although maybe this could be a Norwegian. There he is going off to his house there. But there are many words in there which are accepted and familiar. Now, another...
I encourage you to watch the whole talk when you have a chance. It's about 18 minutes long. Riccardi is a good storyteller, and his anecdotes do a nice job of illustrating culture and cultural norms. What we want to take away from this piece in particular is the definition he gives for culture. According to Riccardi, culture is a system of behavior that helps us act in an accepted or familiar way. We use this as our working definition of culture. It may seem simple, but the system of behavior is complex. We recognize that there are multiple definitions of culture, just as there are many interpretations of words in social justice work. We like this one because it is holistic and inclusive while also being concise. Building on that understanding of culture, let's look now at cultural awareness. We begin with self-exploration, as Riccardi also suggests. We ground ourselves in our lived experiences because greater awareness of self helps build our awareness in relation to others, and that awareness works toward cultural competence. If we think about culture as learned behaviors that are accepted and familiar, then cultural awareness means being cognizant, observant, and conscious of similarities and differences among and between cultural groups. Let's look at some examples. As this iceberg concept of culture illustrates, culture is built up of both visible and invisible traits, or explicit and subtle. For example, at the tip of the iceberg, we are aware of cultural norms around food and cooking, around the arts, around accepted and familiar clothing. Underneath the water are the norms that are less explicit, not at the forefront of our awareness, such as body language, facial expressions, ideas about beauty, about adolescence. These norms help make up the foundation of our values and beliefs. Let's look at some more examples of cultural norms. Our own cultural norms may be so familiar to us that we take them for granted. We're not necessarily conscious of them. They're so accepted and familiar to us. They can be second nature. but building our awareness of different norms helps us to navigate diverse cultural spaces and interactions. We've put up a few examples that compare what's considered, quote, mainstream or historically dominant or centered American culture with other cultures. Sense of self and space might look like an informal handshake or more formal hugs or bows. Communication and language might mean explicit, direct communication, or it might mean implicit, indirect communication. Food and eating habits might look like eating as a necessity, including fast food, or dining as a social experience, or one guided by religious rules. So let's talk now about working toward cultural competence, which is an intrapersonal or internal capacity. This is perhaps counterintuitive, since interacting with other people is interpersonal, but the foundation for effective interactions with others comes from within. In the TEDx talk, Riccardi expresses that same idea, that understanding culture and engaging with other cultures starts with understanding ourselves. So what do we mean by cultural competence? It's the skills, knowledge, and awareness of yourself in your interaction with others. That includes an awareness of our own cultural identities and views about difference. Cultural competence is an ongoing process or journey, and it has this goal: to assist you in recognizing what you can do to become more effective in working and living in a diverse environment. In other words, building self-awareness and applying that awareness to interactions with others with diverse cultural norms and identities. So what does that look like? It looks like going into or interacting with a community with the openness to learn, with curiosity, and with a sense of humility. Which brings us to cultural humility. We can't know all things about all cultures, but we can be open to learning. A distinction might be not telling you what I know about your culture, but asking you and listening. Humility means engaging in lifelong learning and critical self-reflection, recognizing and challenging power imbalances, and holding ourselves accountable for our own assumptions and biases. The term cultural humility was coined in 1998 by physicians Melanie Tervalon and Jan Murray Garcia. As they define it, cultural humility entails both a lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and self-critique, and the ability to recognize our own beliefs and assumptions, and to break through commonly held assumptions and stereotypes that can get in the way of being competent or sensitive in another's culture. As noted in the beginning of this webinar, we approach this work from a social justice framework. Self-reflection and education is a part of this work, but social justice means that we need to look beyond the individual experiences to recognize the institutional power dynamics. 3 factors guide this work. The first is lifelong learning and critical self-reflection. Underlying this is the idea that we are never finished learning. We must remain humble and flexible to allow ourselves to be open to different experiences. Second, we need to recognize and challenge power imbalances. This is important as speakers or presenters. The nature of speaking on a topic means that you hold knowledge or power that the audience does not have. An awareness of your own power, as well as the power dynamics within events like conferences, professional development events, and lectures, is part of developing cultural humility. We are often asked if we can train presenters or speakers so they will know what to do if they are called out during their session about an issue of equity, diversity, and inclusion. I feel like this question itself demonstrates the power dynamics because there's a fear that comes from having this power, that someone may call you out during your session or critique your take on a topic. There is a fear that you will make a mistake or say the wrong thing. Instead of trying to anticipate any and every possible scenario in which you may be questioned about the content of your scholarship or the environment of the room in which you're speaking, it is more useful to be open to criticism and recognize that you are on a journey like everyone else. You will begin to recognize that these are learning spaces, and we can learn even when we are teaching. Cultural humility requires that you be in community with your audience, Being open to learning something new changes the dynamic in spaces where you are being challenged by making everyone aware that learning is the primary goal. The third factor is institutional accountability. What we mean by this is that cultural humility is larger than our individual experiences. Making those changes and encouraging them in others will lead to institutional or systemic change. All of this is built upon our awareness of cultural and cultural competence. We can create policies, laws, and rules to address inequities, but upholding them requires a shift in individuals. This shift is necessary for social change. Cultural humility relies on an understanding of how we create and perpetuate systems of oppression. Binary frames play an important and insidious role in systems of oppression. Binaries are social constructs that are composed of two parts that are absolute and unchanging opposites. Human beings instinctively categorize the world. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. However, if we don't examine where the categories were created or why they were created, then we can easily create unintentional roadblocks. Our brains naturally want to fit things neatly into different boxes. Of course, as we've been talking about, when it comes to cultural competence, it's about understanding complex issues and learning to become comfortable in the journey, as well as reaching for the goal. We need to consider, are we perpetuating and or framing our conversations, presentations, and scholarship in restrictive and reductive binary ways? It is when we reduce things down to the binary lens that we are often called out for ignoring the complexity. Some things to remember about binary framing. It is both reductive, there are more than two genders, for example, and hierarchical, establishing and reinforcing power and oppression or subordination. Binary thinking assigns meaning in relation and opposition to two sides, in which one becomes centered or, quote, the norm, and one becomes, quote, other. They're unequal relationships. Raising our awareness that this is an easy trap to fall into should encourage us to be more intentional in our communications. It does not mean that you will be perfect. There is no perfect, but as presenters, you may be challenged to consider an alternative frame. Hopefully, this will allow you to respond with curiosity and a sense of humility while continuing on with the content of your session. And if we begin to understand that there are so many elements like intersectionality and binary lenses, it gives us a place to examine what we might do differently in the future. I'm going to practice reframing the binary lens by saying that you will always be evolving your work and how you hold a space throughout your lifetime. There is no right or wrong way. Instead, we do things differently and engage our cultural humility to become more comfortable in lacking a single answer. As we think about framing in language, we might consider how to make our language more inclusive, using gender-neutral language, for example, and pronoun name tags. We might ask someone when they're speaking from the audience to please stand if you are able. These shifts in our perceptions allow us to begin acting in more inclusive ways. That is important to create systemic change. Part of this work is becoming comfortable with ambiguity. We know that the system uses binary frames to perpetuate itself, and we need to be cognizant of that to create change. Since oppression works through setting up dualistic frames that privilege some groups and exclude others, deconstructing the binaries and recognizing the individual and social complexities and variety they hide can be an important tool for change. Binary framing undermines public discourse in two ways. First, it limits the issues on the table, thereby creating artificial constraints on the breadth of the dialogue. And second, it decreases the probability that people will come together in dialogue because mutually exclusive differences are accentuated rather than differences being meaningfully explored to find common ground and potential interrelations. A concept necessitated by the binary lens is intersectionality. The term intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a lawyer and current professor at Columbia Law School. It is a concept that aims to create a frame to provide visibility and understanding to the reality that there are many people who are impacted by more than one identity. This short video gives a helpful explanation of intersectionality.
What is intersectionality? Intersectionality is a way of understanding social relations by examining intersecting forms of discrimination. This means acknowledging that social systems are complicated and that many forms of oppression, like racism, sexism, and ageism, might be present and active at the same time in a person's life. Everyday approaches to building equality tend to focus on one type of discrimination, for instance sexism, and then work to address only that specific concern. But while the career of a young, white and able-bodied woman might improve with gender equality protections, an older, black, disabled lesbian may continue to be hampered by racism, ageism, ableism and homophobia in the workplace. Intersectionality is about understanding and addressing all potential roadblocks to an individual or group's well-being. But it's not as simple as just adding up oppressions and addressing each one individually. Racism, sexism and ableism exist on their own, but when combined, they compound and transform the experience of oppression. Intersectionality acknowledges that unique oppressions exist, but is also dedicated to understanding how they change in combination. The roots of intersectionality lie within the Black feminist movement, with legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw originating the term. Crenshaw felt that anti-racist and feminist movements were both overlooking the unique challenges faced by black women. She stated that legislation about race is framed to protect black men, and legislation about sexism is understood to protect white women. So simply combining racism and sexism together does not therefore protect black women. Intersectional theory is now applied across a range of social divisions and also to understandings of domination, such as those associated with whiteness, masculinity, and heterosexuality. Intersectionality is not only about multiple identities, and it's not a simple answer to solving problems around equality and diversity. It is, however, an essential framework as we truly engage with issues around privilege and power and work to bring them into the open. Intersectionality means listening to others, examining our own privileges, and asking questions about who may be excluded or adversely affected by our work. As importantly, it means taking measurable action to invite, include, and centre the voices and work of marginalised individuals.
Crenshaw coined this term because she saw it as roads intersecting. Racism and sexism are two roads that come together for women of color. Previously, this was seen as two separate roads where there was no frame for the experiences of women of color. Their experiences were put into one of the two lanes and completely ignored where they intersect. Intersectionality was Crenshaw's way of giving a name to this phenomenon. We encourage you to watch another TED Talk by Kimberly Crenshaw called The Urgency of Intersectionality. We will list it as a resource at the end of the webinar. There is some really strong work out there exploring intersectionality. We will list a few resources at the end of the webinar. Ijoma Oluo is an author, and in her book, So You Want to Talk About Race, she defines intersectionality. She defines it as the belief that our social justice movements must consider all of the intersections of identity, privilege, and oppression that people face in order to be just and effective. Intersectionality is a useful framework to understand as a speaker or presenter. It demonstrates how complicated this work is and why it needs to be a lifelong process. It is also a reminder that there is importance to being cognizant of the many areas of oppression or privilege that may impact our spaces. A practical example of this is the use of microphones in sessions. We are hyper-aware of visible diversity within the rooms where we speak, but how often have you been in a session where someone will stand up and say, "I don't need a mic, do I?" And nobody challenges this. We tend to focus our energies on being sensitive to racial and gender identities in the language we use, but we often dismiss the use of a tool that provides a more inclusive experience for our participants. When that happens, You are asking the people with hearing impairment to be responsible for everyone else's sensitivity in the room. Intersectionality helps us ensure that fewer people are left behind and that our efforts to do better for some do not make things far worse for others. In summary, cultural competence is the skills, knowledge, and awareness of yourself and your interactions with others. That awareness may be developed by exploring culture, cultural humility, intersectionality, and the binary lens. These skills and awareness develop over a lifetime and play a part in our personal spaces, our professional spaces, and in the presentations and talks that we give as professionals. They are in every space. As we begin to develop as speakers and presenters, we have some questions we encourage you to consider every time you are preparing to speak. For example, how might race, gender, sexuality, ability, or class impact this subject? Could identity differences be contributing to differences of opinion or perspective? Does my scholarship reflect a diversity of identities? Am I looking for what I don't know? Am I providing a safe space for marginalized people to speak out? None of these should have a single answer, nor should they be resolved before you speak. But the action of reflecting on this will help you to anticipate what might be brought to the surface during your talk. They are intended to provide some focus for exploring the various frameworks we have discussed today. As we build on these various frameworks that make up today's webinar on cultural competence, we understand that we are just providing some very high-level introductory information. We chose these frameworks to focus on because we felt that as you are viewing this from the lens of your work as speakers or facilitators, these concepts demonstrate various pieces that you may be confronted with. Hopefully, this will spark your curiosity to explore each of these frameworks in more depth. In our office, we say that this is everybody's everyday work. We remind ourselves that it is ongoing work. It requires that we make mistakes and learn from them. And it is work without a magic checklist. Here are the resources we referenced. The Urgency of Intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw, a TED Talk. Cross-Cultural Communication by Pellegrino Riccardi, the TED Talk we viewed a clip of. What is Intersectionality? The video we watched. So You Want to Talk About Race, a book by Ijoma Oluo. The American Library Association Office for Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services website, and the ACRL Diversity Standards. Thank you, and please reach out with any questions or anything you might want to follow up on from this webinar. Thanks again.